What do you build when you're the most powerful person in the world, and your entire civilization thinks you're a living god? Not a beach house, and certainly not a modest villa. You build a palace out of mud. No, really. Most royal palaces in ancient Egypt were made from the same stuff as village homes, sun-baked mud brick. But why didn't they use stone like they did for the pyramids? And how do you run an empire from a structure that could melt in the rain? Let's dig into how royal palaces were built from scratch, and why they mattered so much more than we often realize. Now, aside from being homes for the pharaohs, ancient Egyptian palaces also doubled as government HQs. But here's the thing. Unlike temples or tombs, most of these palaces didn't last. They were built mainly from mud brick and organic stuff, which, surprise, doesn't do great over a few thousand years. Now, pharaohs didn't pick palace sites at random. There was always a reason. Sometimes strategic, sometimes symbolic. The earliest rulers ran the show from Memphis. Then, Amenemhat I, during the 12th dynasty, decided he wanted a fresh start. So, he moved the capital to It-Tawe, probably to keep tighter control over politics and resources. A bit later, Akhenaten goes full iconoclast. He builds a brand new city, Akhetaten, now known as Amarna. He built it on land he claimed was untouched by any god or human. He said the sun god Aten led him there. Then you've got Rameses II, who sets up Pi-Rameses in the Nile Delta. It had military advantages, sure, but it also happened to be his hometown. Coincidence? Probably not. Most palaces were built near water. It made sense. Transport, supply lines, the usual logistics. Then there's Malkata, the massive palace of Amenhotep III, which had its own man-made harbor. Even desert palaces like Amarna found workarounds like wells, imported water, or anything to keep things running. And yes, building a palace also meant that rituals were involved, religious ceremonies, to mark the start. Texts like the Papyrus Harris say Rameses III's palace at Medinet Habu had gold balconies and electrum-covered columns. Now, layout-wise, these places were huge and highly organized. Take Malkata. Dozens of rooms, ceremonial halls, even a separate palace for Queen Tiye. Royal kids had their own wing, away from the main action. Then there were the practical areas like offices, storerooms, workshops, servant quarters. The whole machine of rule, all in one place. And at the heart of many palaces was the throne hall. This often led to the window of appearances, where the king handed out gifts or showed up to remind everyone who was boss. Private quarters included bedrooms, lounges, changing rooms, and sometimes a harem. Malkata had the full set, but eventually the harem area was used for storage. Make of that what you will. Furthermore, kitchens were nearby for quick service, but tucked out of sight. And then there were the gardens. Big, fertile, water-filled spaces. Malkata had sprawling gardens, and even a harbor lake. Amarna's North Palace, on the other hand, which was possibly Nefertiti's, had a sunken garden with tree pits and a bird pool. Over time, however, palace designs changed. But we'll talk about that another time. For now, let's talk materials. Again, these weren't marble monuments. Nile silt mixed with straw, molded, dried, and stacked. That was the norm for homes and palaces across dynastic Egypt. Stone, on the other hand, was rare. Aside from tombs and temples, stone was reserved for key parts like door frames, thresholds, and columns. At Amarna and Pyrameses, you'll find limestone or granite door jambs stamped with royal names. A little flex at the front door. And inside, column bases were made from limestone, gypsum, or sandstone, depending on the site. Cedar beams spanned big halls. Acacia or palm wood covered smaller rooms. Even the walls and floors got a makeover, plastered with gypsum or lime, then painted over. And they didn't hold back on decoration. Whitewashed walls, faience tiles, colorful mosaics. Avaris even had Minoan-style frescoes, suggesting a bit of artistic exchange. Or at least someone said, "Hey, that looks nice. Let's copy it." As for Medinet Habu, oh boy, that one went full luxury. According to Papyrus Harris, it had electrum-plated columns and a gold-covered balcony. Because, you know, subtlety. Ornamentation was everywhere. Shiny bricks, inlaid stone, carved alabaster. Thrones, on the other hand, ranged from plain mud brick to wood covered in gold leaf. And all these materials, they came from all over. Cedar and ebony, for instance, weren't exactly local. Those came from Lebanon and Punt. Punt, by the way, is probably somewhere around modern Somalia or Eritrea. But anyway, even the mud was managed carefully. Nearby fields supplied it in massive quotas. We're talking tens of thousands of bricks made by hand. Amarna used local marl clay until they ran out. At that point, they either moved on or got creative. As for stone, it came from nearby cliffs. Limestone, gypsum, and sandstone came from Upper Egypt. Granite from Aswan. They reused a lot, too. After Akhenaten's reign, Amarna was basically strip-mined. Its blocks ended up at other cities like Hermopolis. Nothing went to waste. And as for labor, that was state-run. A lot of Egyptians were conscripted during the Nile flood season, when farming paused. They weren't slaves, but they didn't exactly have a choice. Still, they were paid and organized into work teams. And sometimes they complained. One papyrus basically says, "Hey, we can't make bricks, there's no straw." So yes, even in ancient Egypt, paperwork and shortages went hand in hand. Captives too did some labor, especially on minor tasks. One tomb painting from Rekhmir shows Asiatic and Nubian prisoners making bricks. Usually, Egyptian overseers would stand nearby with sticks. It's not subtle, and it definitely mirrors the Exodus story, which may have borrowed a few real details. Nevertheless, the state had a whole bureaucracy to keep things moving. Officials like the Overseer of Works tracked laborers, materials, and who didn't show up. Documents like the Reisner Papyri list bricklayers, carpenters, painters, all under foremen and specialists. Skilled workers handled the delicate stuff. Masons set floors. Carpenters made furniture. Painters showed up with their tools in hand and left actual pallets behind, many of which we've found. Even the storage jars had labels. At Malkata, for example, seals mention palace stewards and jars tagged, "King's wife, may she live." This was likely meant for Queen Tiye. So behind the splendor, you had logistics, labels, and a lot of mud. Welcome to the real machinery of royal Egypt. Scribes, as always, kept track of supplies. Workers were paid in grain or beer, sometimes both, if it was a good day. But still, there was structure. At places like Malkata and Deir el Medina, workers had proper housing and meals. But now, let's talk about the construction process. You see, the first step on any site is to flatten the land. They used dirt and gypsum for that. Then came a layer of sand or rubble for the foundations. Palaces were often laid out on grids aligned with the cardinal directions. At pyramids, thick mud brick walls up to 5 meters held up upper floors. Corners got reinforced with wood or stone. Here, columns were key. They helped reduce the span of roof beams, and in storage rooms, builders used mud brick arches or corbelling to form vaults. Columns also held up giant halls. Texts mention forests of cedar pillars. It was probably poetic, but still impressive nonetheless. Amarna's great audience hall had somewhere between 20 and 32 wooden columns. As for living spaces, they had flat roofs. They were good for sunbathing or pretending to do chores. But on average, roofs were often flat, short wooden beams, layered with reed mats and mud plaster, strong enough to stand on during ceremonies, or just to sneak a better view. Construction usually followed the post and lintel model, wood columns on stone bases. Some were made of limestone, others carved wood, painted like blue lotuses. These were stylish, even under a dusty ceiling. Heavy beams for the roof were usually hoisted up using ramps or levers. We don't have palace building scenes, but tomb art shows carpenters at work lifting beams, setting doors, and so on. Walls still have little holes from the scaffolding. Now, the tools were pretty basic. Brick molds, hoes, baskets, plumb bobs, measuring squares, these type of tools. Surveyors probably used rope grids and the good old 3-4-5 triangle to get those perfect right angles. But to move the heavy stuff, they used ropes, sledges, and sweat. At pyramids, some floors were sloped to drain out waste, because yes, hygiene mattered, sort of. Lower walls were extra thick, foundations were wide, and wooden tie beams held it all together. But in general, floors were sometimes just earth. Other times, painted plaster. Amarna had a floor painted with fish and birds. It's in the Cairo Museum now. Malkata, on the other hand, liked geometric and marsh scenes. Stone flooring often showed up in high-traffic areas like palace entrances. But to circle back to plumbing for a bit, some palaces had water features. Amarna's North Palace, for instance, had a tiled basin with a drain, probably just for royalty. Water usually came in from the outside, carried by servants. Large sites had cisterns or wells. Pyramids even had small cisterns for the horse stables. But a lot of palaces just used jars or stored water in their kitchen or bath areas. Functional, if not exactly spa-like. And then there were stairs, which led to upper levels, supported by pillars or hefty walls. Palace walls, on the other hand, made a statement. Some were up to 10 meters thick and sloped for stability. As for palace facade patterns, those recessed panels, they symbolized royal authority. You even see them in royal names like the Serek. Now, when it comes to palace doors, they were made from pretty thick wood like cedar, acacia, or sycamore fig, all on pivot pins set in stone sockets. At Amarna, you can still see worn-down limestone from years of doors swinging open and shut. Windows, however, were small, high, and sometimes covered with wooden or stone lattices. One ornate example comes from Medinet Habu. Most windows had shutters, except for the window of appearance, where, as we mentioned earlier, the king made his dramatic entrance. But in the end, not every palace was really a palace. You see, some were for ceremony, some part temple. Later, pharaohs built both at once, places made for ritual and display. At Medinet Habu, Ramesses III's palace still has a few parts left, a window frame and some worn steps. So even in ruins, the show goes on.